And Colleen, I think I'm going to make you co-host just a hot mic hunt. We had one last night. Didn't last long, but sometimes I worry about what's happening when I can't see it. If I can see it and I know nothing's wrong, that's fine. But if somebody's head's just bonked down on their laptop, that disturbs me because I can't see video. Okay, so the Torah portion is Vayechi, which is and lived. And the title I picked out, and I think you'll see why when we get to it, is Egypt wails and Torah never fails. And for those who are listening by audio, the readings are Genesis 47:28 through 50:26, 1 Kings 2:1 through 12, Psalm 41, and Matthew 27:27 through 32. And I'll just put an asterisk right there that the passage I'll be reading from in class is taken out of the Hebrew Matthew, a translation of the Hebrew Matthew, which pulls out some details that we don't get from the Greek Gospels. And I think those details are vital to decoding what's going on in this particular Torah portion as it pertains to the behavior of both Jacob and his fear that he would be buried among the Egyptians, and how the Egyptians behaved when they reached the promised land. So, and here's your memory book. We will be finishing this book because this is the end of Bereshit. And so next week we'll be going into Shemot. And that would complete this book for you, this particular sefer. And the sentence that I made to go with the final Torah portion of Bereshit is, and Jacob and his family, Vayechi, lived in Egypt, where he blessed them, and where eventually Jacob and Joseph died. And when we finish a book of the Torah, after each book, we say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, which is be strong, and may we be strengthened. And so I just want to review a few things from last week, because in the same way that I know next week's just a continuation of this week and really getting into the belly of the dragon, this week is an extension of last week, understanding the two missions of Joseph and Judah, and how at some point they will become so close that no spirit will be able to go between them. And in this Torah portion, we see the blessings on the sons. We have two separate events. We have Jacob calling Joseph in because he wants to bless Joseph's two sons and basically adopt them as his own, so that they would have, equal portions with the other tribes. And in anticipation, I'm sure, knowing that Levi will not have a property portion among the 12 tribes, and there always has to be 12, then by adopting Ephraim and Manasseh, you're replacing that. You're making sure that you maintain the 12. So we see that particular blessing where he says, "Who are these?" And then toward the end of the portion, we see the blessing on the brothers. And we see that the house of Joseph is not neglected. In fact, he receives an extra portion in Shechem, which is where he's buried, by the way. Because remember, Joseph too requested that his bones not be left in Egypt when they return to the land. One of the blessings that was attached to Ephraim and Manasseh is that they would multiply like fish. And that multiplication like fish, we know, carries forward, because when Yeshua begins to call his disciples, first he calls fishermen. So that gives us a hint, sneak peek, that he is on this mission to recover some lost fish from the house of Joseph. And in the same way, we have a not so good prophecy, which is against Leviathan, which is against the Tanin, the dragon. And next week, we'll look at that equivalence of expression as it applies to Pharaoh. But with Leviathan, or with Tanin, the dragon, the sea dragon, we also know the prophecy is that many fish are going to stick to his scales. And those fish are his warriors. And if we look at the Exodus from Egypt, then it was the chariots and the horsemen who rode with Pharaoh in pursuit of Israel. Those were the fish that stuck to the scales of the dragon, who is Pharaoh. He's the dragon of the Nile, the sea dragon. In the same way, and this is eventually going to blow your mind, how close the beast and the dragon are to Messiah and Elijah. That's why I said I knew it was going to take an extra class session, because I didn't want to spring that on you without time to make a full explanation. But at this point, really all I want you to see is that you have two different directions that a person could go. You could be one of those fish that are going to stick to the scales of Israel, so to speak. You're going to stick to the scales of Yeshua so that no spirit can go between you. It's the seal is that tight. In fact, the seal of the scale is chatam, which would be the same as in Revelation, where he opens the 7 seals, chatam. By the same token, you could go in a different direction, and then you could be sticking to the scales of Pharaoh. And of course, we don't want anybody to do that. And so here's the description of Leviathan, which, like I said, next week we'll do a word study to show you how Leviathan, the Tanin, and the Nakash, the 3 kinds of dragons, are equivalent expressions. So it says, nothing on earth is like him, Leviathan, one made without fear. And he looks on everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. So think of the 7 abominations of the wicked lamp we had last week. It begins with a proud look. And that's exactly how Leviathan is described. He looks on everything that is high. He's king over all the sons of pride. Well, if you're a son of pride, then you can progress through those 7 abominations, eventually becoming the most abominable thing, a false witness who breathes out lies and separates brothers as a result. And if you also think of it in terms of the menorah, the 7th spirit of Adonai is Yirat Adonai. It's the reverence of Adonai. And it's the beginning of all wisdom, which is the first spirit of Adonai. So it circles around. So if we say Leviathan is one made without fear or reverence, we can also say that he is one without wisdom, because wisdom is kind of the antidote to pride, because wisdom hews out her 7 pillars. It's a spiritual attribute. But Leviathan is a type of rebel. And because of his pride, he wants things to stick to him. He's never going to stick to anyone else. He only wants things stuck up under him. And so we also talked about the reunion of Judah and Joseph, or Judah and Israel, the 2-stick prophecy, which is a continuation of the dry bones of resurrection. And we know that what Ezekiel sees is these 2 houses, these one translation said these two wooden tablets, they come to life and they stand on their feet. They become an exceedingly great army. And I believe this is why when the dragon is thrown down in Revelation, he knows he has a short time, because in a sense, he can see the writing on the wooden tablets. He can see the houses of Judah and Joseph getting closer and closer and closer and closer. And so once he sees Judah and Joseph begin to draw together, I think that's when he's at his most furious, and he comes down to earth, and then he begins to sow things between the two that he's never had to worry about, for the past 1900 years. As soon as the Christian church split from their Jewish brothers, then that was a battle he didn't have to fight. But now that the house of Judah and Joseph are getting closer and closer, he knows his time is short, because once they come together, there is a resurrection, and then there is an exceedingly great army that he cannot defeat. And so that was pretty much a summation of last week's lesson. The two sticks becoming one. Joseph's mission of evangelizing the nations is going to be fulfilled. Everybody's had the opportunity to hear the gospel. Every nation has heard the gospel and been given a time period to make a choice. And then in the same way, we see the leadership of Judah's Torah observance. And so both of these houses are going to return to the mountains of Israel with their companions, people who have attached themselves to them. And last night we talked about what a daughter is, a dependent town, village, or even system upon the bigger system. And so each of those will have its own daughters, those who depend upon that group. And again, I think this is why the dragon knows his time is short. It's going to be a phenomenon. And if you realize that you're part of a phenomenon, then you should also realize that the dragon is furious right now, because he at no point wants to see the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God brought together so close that they're like the scales of Leviathan. They're sealed up and nothing can get in between them. And so Leviathan, who again is one type of the dragon, the Tanin, like Pharaoh, is another type of the dragon. But it said that this Leviathan, that as far as I know, no human being in this generation has ever seen, is a great sea serpent who envelops the whole world. One midrash, and remember, you take midrash with a grain of salt, because sometimes it's just teaching you a lesson, not something real. But it says that Leviathan's influence is around the whole earth, so much so that his head overlaps his tail, that he's permeated the whole world. And it said that at the end of days, that Messiah is going to defeat Leviathan. He's going to make a meal for the righteous at the end of days. And there is going to be the skin of Leviathan is going to be made into a canopy for a sukkah. And it's going to be a sukkah for Mount Zion. So the righteous will eat Leviathan, and they will enjoy the shade from a sukkah made by his skin. Right? And the assumption here is that the righteous, they really have become the one stick, the one tablet. So, like Leviathan, Egypt's ruler is the sea dragon. He is the Tanin. He is a father kingdom to all the kingdoms that have attempted to destroy Israel. And I didn't quite get that. And then this morning when I was studying, it was really clear. It was discussing again the subjection in Egypt to Pharaoh, and how part of the prophecy given to Abraham included Egypt, but also the 4 kingdoms that are part of the image of the beast and Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Egypt is not part of that dream of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not part of that image of the beast because he's the one who gives the power and the authority to the beast. So there is a relationship, but you don't need to see Egypt. You just need to know that that is where the power is derived from. It's derived from the dragon. So Egypt is the father kingdom to all these other kingdoms that we looked at last night, because we were examining what it means to be a daughter of Jerusalem, but also what it means to be a daughter of these other world systems. And so Egypt is the father kingdom to the 4 kingdoms. And there's actually more than that, because when you get down to the feet and the toes, you can see a mixture. You can see that there have been daughters born out of the Iron Kingdom. And they mingle, but they don't marry. And so we tried to explain what that might be in this generation, particularly. But from the beginning, the dragon has always wanted to destroy Israel. It's wanted to destroy its people, its covenant, and then to occupy the covenant land. And so as we read through the Torah portion of Vayechi, we're going to get hints to Pharaoh's role as the sea monster. You'll get it more as they're going through the Reed Sea. You'll get an even better idea, because Pharaoh is going to be like Leviathan with a hook in his jaw. He's going to be drawn into the sea thinking that Israel's, their God has deserted them, or their God's not very smart, because he led them straight into a trap. And what he finds out is that he's actually the one who's been reeled in. He's the sea monster. He's the dragon that is destroyed in the sea. And so when we look at Egypt and what it means to us, what it means to us today, what is this influence of Leviathan that is so worldwide that his head would overlap his tails, but so to speak. It's that influential. And I think from the beginning of time, it's been our idea of death misconstrued. Because if we truly understood death and life, then we would live our lives with an understanding of what death involves. And so the idea of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, or the idea that it's human beings who create everlasting kingdoms. There's all sorts of twists and turns to Leviathan. You can't pin him down on how many ways he deceives us as to what happens after we die. Because if we really got it, we would change our behavior. And so this ability to deceive people as to the nature of death, which he did from the beginning. He deceived Eve as to the nature of death. He said, you will not surely die. He said, you misunderstand death. And the thing is, because she took on his thinking concerning death, she misconstrued what death was, how it worked. Then she attached herself to his scales. And of course she died because she didn't understand. And then once you die, even though the physical body is alive, they had begun to die. At that instant of sin, the body begins to die. And so this power of deception, this authority concerning what happens after we die, what are the rules of the resurrection, so to speak, that power to deceive the whole world, he gives to his offspring. He's going to give to his own descendants. He will pass this power and this authority onto the beast. And that's what King Nebuchadnezzar sees. He sees both a human image, but then also in Daniel, they're described, each of these kingdoms is described as a particular beast. These beasts pop up again in Revelation. And so these four kingdoms and then their mingled offspring will be subject to the deception of the dragon, because he has given a throne and authority and power to the beast. And that's why we see Babylon, the golden head, as reasonable in terms of creating the image of the beast as a human being. But because the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, literally did go mad and behave like a beast, just in case we weren't getting the message. So let's get into the actual Torah portion. Genesis 47:29. It says, when the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand under my thigh and deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Please do not bury me in Egypt. But when I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. So notice there's two steps here. When somebody dies, they lie down with their fathers, or they're gathered to their fathers. And there's more than one explanation for that. I mean, that literally happens when the bones were collected and put into a common box. I mean, your bones were literally gathered to your fathers. But there's also a soul understanding to this, that when the body does lie down, at that point, you were gathered to your fathers. So 2 steps. When I lie down with my fathers, you shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. So 2 important steps. There's the actual crossing over or lying down with your fathers. And then there is a step of death that's important, and that's the burial. It's the time of your lying down is not truly within your hand. You can make it if you're suicidal, but the time of your lying down really is one of those divine appointments. And the place of your burial, to a certain extent, it is under your power, because you can designate where you want to be buried and how you want to be buried. Jacob says, okay, I know I'm going to die here, but please don't bury me here. I may have to die in Egypt, but I don't want to be buried in Egypt. That's important. And Joseph said, I will do as you have said. He said, swear to me. So he swore to him. Then Israel bowed in worship at the head of the bed. Now think of Yeshua when he's on the cross. The gospel specifically tell us that he cries out, he gives up the ghost, and then he bows his head. And there's going to be some similarities between this death and burial of Jacob and the death and burial of Yeshua. And so this burial is so important to Jacob. And we know that Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, there at Hebron, at Kiryat Arba, is said to be an entrance to the Garden of Eden. And so to be buried there is a sign of faith in the resurrection. This sign of resurrection is so important to Jacob that he doesn't assign the task of hewing out the grave for himself to an attendant, to a servant, to a hired hand. Instead, Genesis 50 verse 3 tells us that Jacob had dug the grave at Machpelah with his own hands. He did it himself. He didn't delegate. And so maybe for us, that's a message when it comes to burial. Try not to leave that in someone else's hands, because there's expectations. You have certain expectations embedded in you that the manner of your burial can actually be a proclamation of the good news in itself. I mean, you say, well, how would that apply to me? Well, I don't know, maybe choose beforehand what you're going to put on your headstone. I don't know, but there's a pattern here. And how you were buried can continue to send a message to your descendants and people who knew you, and maybe even people who never met you. We'll see that. But it's important. And he says, not in Egypt, not in Egypt, not here. All right, so it's, as we continue in the text, as we go into chapter 50, verse 7, we can see a very subtle change that happens here, where it seems like Joseph is on top of the world at this point. In the burial processional, we can see that the Egyptians do something that should make us kind of narrow one eye as we read it. It says, so Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph and his brothers and his father's household. Do you see how the house of Pharaoh and the elders of the land of Egypt have just gone before Jacob's own family in the funeral processional? And that's not how family processionals go. It's in a burial, it's always the family, and then the dignitaries, and then the people who are more on the perimeter, maybe of the person's life. And all of a sudden here, we see the Egyptians, the servants of Pharaoh, who eventually are going to be the ones in the generation of Moses. It's the servants of Pharaoh who will finally tell him, don't you know that Egypt is Abda, destroyed, destruction. And the same root there is Abaddon, which we get in the book of Revelation. So the Egyptians get in front of Jacob's household at his burial processional. It says they left only their little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. I don't know if you're noticing the order of things there, but it's significant. Pharaoh's servants go first, and the elders of the land of Egypt, then the house of Jacob, household of Joseph, household of Jacob, and then following them almost as if in pursuit. It says there also went up with them both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. Remember that phrase. It was the chariots and the horsemen. They were a very great company. And so at this point, it's almost like prophecy that even though things appear to be okay right now, this is picturing something in the future, that the chariots and the horsemen may be in pursuit of Jacob's household at some point. All right, and it's going to happen basically when Adonai destroys Egypt, so that they can't go ahead. And here's the curiouser part of the text. In Genesis 50, verse 11, it says, now when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians. Therefore, it was named Avel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Now, this is completely odd in more than one way. The Canaanites see the mourning that's going on, and they don't say this is a grievous mourning for the house of Jacob. They say this is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians. It's not the Israelites who seem to be doing the greatest and loudest grieving. It's the Egyptians that are making such a commotion that is so loud that they changed the name of the spot. And it's called a tad. It's a threshing floor. And a tad, I put the definition for you up there. It's a bramble or a thorn. And it's down there at the bottom of the Strong's definitions. It says probably meaning to pierce or to make fast, like to weave something together or to stick something together. A thorn tree. Okay, that should have wheels turning in your head right now. If they're grieving at this place, a tad, and we know it means thorns, from a root that means to pierce or to fasten, to weave together, then that's not only bringing us forward into the history they're about to have with the Egyptians, it's taking you all the way forward into the Gospels. But this is what they say, a tad. It's so loud, they rename it Abel Mitzrayim, like the grief of Egypt. Because Mitzrayim is Egypt, the grief, the suffering of Egypt. Abel Mitzrayim. But if you also look into the Strong's entry in Roman numeral 2, it says, as it's explaining atad, said the threshing atad, meaning thorn, also called Abel Mitzrayim, and afterwards called Beit Hogla, was located on the west of Jordan between the Jordan and Jericho. And from that spot, I texted a few of you yesterday that I knew had been to Beit Hogla with us to see if any of you had some pictures you could send me where I could, so everybody could see what Beit Hogla looks like and who is there. Hopefully we'll get some eyewitness testimony as to who is there and what her mission is this week or next week. But Beit Hogla, the place also known as Avel Mitzrayim, the place also known as Atad, it's located at the site of the Jericho crossing. When the Israelites come back to the land after the Exodus from Egypt, after the 40 years in the wilderness, when Joshua, and the short form of his name, of course, is Yeshua, from Yehoshua, he brings the people across right there. And from Beit Hogla, this place where the Egyptians were grieving, you can see Mount Nebo. You can see where Moshe died. And of course, nobody knows where his body is, which there's some strange things about the people who die in this Torah portion, especially Jacob, and some of the traditions that go with his death. And again, we may not be meant to take them literally, but we're supposed to learn a lesson from them. But this place where the Egyptians are grieving is a really strange choice. Not only the fact that they're grieving louder and they're suffering more than even Jacob's family, so much so that they renamed the location. What you realize is they're a long way off track here. I mean, they obviously don't have Google Maps. They don't have Waze. They don't even have a paper map if they are at Beit Hogla doing their mourning. Because, I mean, they had to pass Hebron up. So it looks like they have buried Jacob at Hebron, at the cave of Machpelah. And then for some strange reason, they keep going. And who does that? I mean, if you've ever walked around that part of Israel, they've already traveled from Egypt. Why in the world would you keep going all the way to the Jordan River? It doesn't make any sense. unless they were pulled by prophecy. There was something at that crossing at Beit Hogla, something on that threshing floor that they were mourning for before it even happened. So I pulled out some bullet points by Rashi. And remember, this is rabbinic commentary. We may not find it written down in scripture, but sometimes there's hints in the commentary, or there's hints in the Midrash, or there's hints in the Mishnah that clarify for us the reasons why something might be a certain way. Rashi tells us that in Genesis 49:33, that the Hebrew text is not clear about Jacob's death. It only says that he breathed his last. And the sages believe that this is a hint that Jacob did not die, that he simply drew in his feet from the natural world and breathed his last. But there was something about Jacob that continued to live at that point. And so that's kind of the one way I try to describe to people when the righteous die. You know, you want to live with one foot in the garden. You want to live with one foot in the kingdom. You want to live with that constant awareness of the word and living the word in your life, so that at the end of your life, whenever that might be, all you're really doing is drawing that other foot in. You're already there to an extent, except your physical body is going to have to die in order for you to be able to draw both your feet into that realm until the resurrection. And then at the resurrection, you know, there's going to be new rules in place in terms of how your body and your spirit and your soul work together. But they say Jacob just drew in his feet from the natural world and breathed his last. That was it. But he didn't die in the sense of, you know, what can happen when people die when they're not prepared for the kingdom. He reads into the text that there was a reluctance on the part of Pharaoh to let Joseph go. And that's because Joseph justifies the journey by saying, I swore to my father. If he was truly in total control of that situation, then he wouldn't need an excuse. He would just says, you know, I'm Pharaoh, I'm going to bury my father. That's not how he words it. He words it as, I swore to my father. In other words, you must let me go because I made a vow that I would not put his bones in Egypt. I would not allow his bones to remain in Egypt. So there was a certain reluctance on the part of Pharaoh. And this is where we're beginning to see things change in their relationship to Egypt. And the third point is the most interesting one to me. The threshing floor of Atad is the Goren Atad. You might even see modern Israelis named Goren. It's a threshing floor. And so it's a very masculine, you know, powerful name. But the Goren Atad, or the threshing floor of Atad, was surrounded by thorns. The kings of Canaan and the princes of Ishmael, it said, came to do battle with the sons of Jacob to prevent Jacob's burial at Machpelah. They didn't want Jacob to be married at Machpelah. They still don't want him to be married at Machpelah. But it says, once they saw Joseph's crown hanging from Jacob's coffin, they all stood, recognizing that Joseph was second in command in all of Egypt. They all stood and hung their crowns from it. Also, they hung their crowns from the coffin and encircled it. They made a circle around it with crowns, like a threshing floor encircled by a fence of thorns. So they didn't do it out of true reverence. They did it kind of out of, well, fear. Because they'd come out to do battle. They realized, oh, this is Joseph when they see the crown. And then they create basically a ring of crowns around the coffin that looked like a fence of thorns, which they're in a place of thorns, a threshing floor. Apparently they would have the thorn bushes around it, which would prevent, critters from getting in there at night and destroying everything. Yeah. But their motivation is what I'm getting at. Their motivation was not true reverence at all. But just an interesting piece of information there. And the lamentation of the Egyptians is odd. Now, some commentators say it was because when Jacob came to Egypt, the Nile returned to its strength, and then Egypt was blessed because Jacob blessed Pharaoh. But there again, the Canaanites, who even changed the name of the place, pointed out that the Egyptians' excessive mourning for Jacob's burial is much, it's ramped up much higher than the Israelites, who you would think would be the ones more in mourning. So there's two things that are going to give us a prophetic clue here. When the Israelites crossed the Sea of Reeds, which by the way is the Yam Suf. Yam is the sea, and sometimes the sea does represent Egypt and Pharaoh. Sometimes it represents the sea of peoples, and you say, well, which one is it? Yes, it applies to both, because remember, Egypt and Pharaoh are this father kingdom from which all the others are derived. So the Yam Suf, literally translated, means the final sea. Suf means the end, final. If you're writing a book and you get to the end and that's the end, you write Hasof, the end. So the Israelites go through the Sea of Reeds. They go through the final sea. It's prophecy. This is the last sea that they will go through. Even though it happened thousands of years ago, it's the sea, it's the final sea we will all go through. And they go through with Moses in leadership. And when they follow Moses, we see that when they go into the sea, that's when the mighty chariots and the horses of Pharaoh were lost. And that goes back to Exodus 10:7, where Pharaoh's servants specifically tell him, don't you know that Egypt is destroyed? Don't you know it's Avda? And this is where we get the permanent construct, Abaddon. And so Egypt is a picture of death, the captivity of death. And they're telling Pharaoh, don't you realize that this Moses guy, what he's doing has destroyed death? That death cannot hold these Israelites? That death cannot hold anybody else in Egypt who attaches themselves to Moses and these people? They're like a second monster, and the fish are attaching themselves to this monster. And part of this is going to go back to the signs of the staff, because in one context it's going to be called the Tanim, the dragon, the sea dragon. At any rate, in a sense, we've got a picture of when we're going to be taken through the sea of death a second time, and we will emerge untouched because of the Yeshuat Adonai, the salvation of Adonai. That's what Moses said, stand still and see the Yeshuat Adonai. And so it's going to be Yeshua, the salvation of Adonai, that leads us through, because death no longer can hold us there. It's been destroyed as it pertains to us. Now, the Sea of Reeds. A reed is a writing tool in that day and time for a scribe. And a scribe writes on books or scrolls. He writes a sefer, a book. Moses was a sofer. He was a scribe. Of course, he receives the commandments already inscribed the first time for the people. And the first set is going to be on tablets. But when he makes the copies, it's going to be in the scroll of the book. In the scroll of the book, it is written of me, right? And so you can see all these words that are spun, or all these daughters that are spun off of Suf. And so they go through the Sea of Reeds. There is a writing that is in the book that is taking place as they cross. It's being written in the scroll of the book as they cross, which helps us, kind of envision the heavens being rolled up like a scroll and so forth. This is just astounding prophecy that is usually told as a kid's story. So the Israelites cross the Reed Sea and they start their journey to the promised land and to a restored garden destiny. And remember, it all seemed lost, like with the golden calf. It's like, oh man, we're not going to be able to enter into immortality because of the golden calf, because we worship the image of the beast. And the commentary says part of the people were deceived who maybe wouldn't have worshiped the calf, but it appeared to come to life. And that's what deceived them. It's the same thing that deceives people in the book of Revelation. The image, the beast who appears to have a fatal head wound, it says he's going to come to life and he's going to deceive people that way. And so if you're not completely vaccinated by the words, you might be deceived by the image of the beast that appears to come to life. So at any rate, there's like, oh my goodness, we've lost this opportunity to go into the land. And when they finally make it after 40 years, when it just seemed like everything was lost, at that point, there's, an extension of the time. And so they're going to cross over with Yehoshua. They're going to cross over at Atad, which today is called Beit Hogla. Beit Hogla, the house of the partridge. And they will do it after Moses' death on Mount Nebo. You can see Mount Nebo from Beit Hogla. You can see the crossing from Beit Hogla. You can see Jericho from Beit Hogla. All sorts of things. This is where Elisha would have seen Eliyahu go up in the divine chariot. The chariots of Israel. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, right? And so you can see how the chariots of Pharaoh would have been mourning at this particular spot. They can see that the chariots of hell, and remember the hell bugs of Abaddon, they do very much resemble armored chariots in some of the descriptions. And so the army of Pharaoh, a household of Pharaoh, mourns right here at Beit Hogla at the crossing where they can see where Moses died. He's the one who led the people through the Yam Suf. He's the one who pointed the people to the Yeshua. And it's under Moses' leadership that they will escape the power of death. They will escape Abaddon. They will make their wilderness journey. Moses, the man, will die on Mount Nebo. And then the Israelites will cross. They will cross the River Jordan right there. And so it's just a beautiful prophetic picture. It's Moses, the Torah, the word of Adonai, the move of the Spirit, because remember, they didn't move until the Spirit moved, until the ark and the cloud moved. And now the Egyptians are, before it happens, they are in the place where this journey is going to culminate. And the journey is going to begin with 10 plagues on Egypt. They're going to come through the Yam Suf. They're going to come through the final sea where those chariots and horsemen are going to be destroyed and sent back to the realm of death, because these children of Jacob, these children of Israel, they have this testimony of salvation. That's what Moshe said. He said, stand still and see the Yeshua. of Adonai. See the salvation. They have the testimony. That's one of the children. And they have the Torah of Moses. That's how they're going to make it through the wilderness. And so the two children of Israel, the testimony and the Torah are right there. And the dragon can see why his time will be short when these two get together, because that's how they're going to cross the Jordan together in unity. So let's look at Matthew again in the Hebrew translation, the Shem Tov translation in Hebrew, which we don't know how much of it is original. We don't know if it is original, but it certainly has some unique things in the Hebrew that don't come through in the English translations of the Greek Gospels. So as I'm reading this, just understand it's coming out of Howard's translation of the Shem Tov. And it's not that I agree 100% with Howard's translation of the Hebrew text. Remember, we looked at the Beatitudes and like, oh my goodness, how did you do this? But that was a translational problem, not a problem of the text. The text was 100% right on. So if we look at Matthew 27:27, we can see that there's some differences in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, of the process of bringing Yeshua through the trial and so forth and the crucifixion. Because the word choice just blew me away when I looked at it. It says, then the horsemen of the court. Well, nowhere else have I read that the Roman soldiers of the court were horsemen. But it says it right there. Then the horsemen of the court took Yeshua under guard and came together before a great company of many people. That's why I said, keep in the back of your mind that the horsemen and the chariots were a great company in Jacob's burial procession. It says they clothed Yeshua with silk garments and covered him with a greenish silk robe. Now, I thought that was really odd because other translations will say red or purple. But where it says greenish, it really makes me think of the pale horse, the yarok in Hebrew. I don't even know what to think about that at this point, but there it is. It says they made a crown of thorns and placed it on his head and set a reed in his right hand. And were bowing down, mocking him. Okay, think of the Canaanites that Rashi says had come out to do battle against the sons of Jacob. And they didn't want Jacob buried there in the land. But once they see the crown of Joseph, they know they can't do that. They can't get the whole Egyptian army after them. And so as almost necessity, maybe internal mockery, it says they placed their crowns around in a circle around the coffin. And we know atad means the thorn bush, the encircling, fastened together thorn bush. And so that's what happens. They make a crown of thorns, place it on his head, put a reed in his right hand, right? Think of the sea of reeds, the Yam Suf, and think of what a reed does. It writes. Moshe was the sofer of the scroll of the book, but Yeshua says, I am the book. He basically says, I am the word. And remember how in Song of Songs, we talked about how when the Torah went out around the earth and then it traveled and then it traveled back and it was graven in the tablets with the right hand. Well, wow. So now they're putting the reed into his right hand. Like an acknowledgement, even though they're mocking, they're still acknowledging that he is the inscriber of the Torah for Israel. And it says they were bowing down and mocking him. That's kind of the reaction they were getting out of the Canaanites. They said, "Peace be upon you, King of the Jews." And then as they were going from the city, now they're taking Yeshua out to crucify him, they met a man whose name was Shimon the Canaanite. You don't read that in the Gospels. You only see that here in the Hebrew version. I think in the Gospels it's Simon the Cyrene. Here they call him Shimon the Canaanite. And then it says they came to a place called Golgotha, which is the place of the skull, by the way. So why the place of the skull? Well, it's going to again to remind us, I think, of Jacob's burial. But let's add a few more pieces of information that Rashi and the Midrash drop for us. Of course, the bullet points. He was accompanied by Roman horsemen, just like the chariots of Pharaoh accompanied Jacob. Yeshua was encircled by a crown of thorns and more of a mockery because of fear. But Yeshua is encircled by a crown of thorns, and it is a mockery. But the fear behind it is that we know that Yeshua's male line was descended from a qualified Davidic dynasty. In other words, if Judea had been allowed to make a king for itself in the first century, Yeshua and his natural brothers would have qualified. That's why the Romans kept bothering them for 100 years after Yeshua ascended. They would still check on the families because they knew that the male members were qualified to be kings. And so that was the fear both among the Romans and among the Jews. And like, oh my gosh, he's actually qualified to be a monarch. He's descended from the line of David. And it's not the father that matters so much in that argument. It's because of the genealogy of the mother, which goes back to a qualified lineage. And so there's that fear there that Yeshua, if he started a revolt, that it would be successful because they would know they had a person qualified for the throne. We see that a Canaanite becomes part of the death processional to this place of the skull. Well, according to Rashi, the Canaanites and the Ishmaelites were both present, and they were there to do battle against the sons of Jacob. But once they see Joseph's crown, they back off and then make the crown of thorns around the coffin. Why the place of the skull? Well, again, you're not going to get this in scripture. You only find it in the Jewish tradition, but it is said that only Esau's skull is buried in the cave of Machpelah. We know that Esau is Edom. Esau is Rome. Rome is the Iron Kingdom. He's like the three before him, which were fathered by Pharaoh. And if you look at the history of those four kingdoms, they are so intermarried and clustered up. You can't divide them out. Some people think Cleopatra was an Egyptian queen. She was a ruler over Egypt, but she was Greek. But she was consorting with Mark Antony, a Roman. I mean, that one picture right there shows you how intermarried. And see, that's kind of what you see. The difference is in the feet and the toes of the image. They don't marry together. But when you look at those four kingdoms, you definitely see intermarriage, that those metals are being merged into one another. So again, just to reiterate from last week, Pharaoh represents the world system to Joseph's house, because remember, his mission has more to do with going to the nations and spreading the testimony. And it is going to be a picture of what Babylon will be to Judah later. And it said that, again, at the end of days, when Judah draws near to Joseph, That's when Messiah comes. The righteous will feast on Leviathan, because they'll finally understand the unity of their mission, and they will become that exceedingly great army of warriors to defeat Leviathan. And this, again, it's why the dragon is concerned. He sees them getting together. He knows his time is short. And that's why we know that the more foolish time we spend railing against Judah, the more that we are pushing off the return of Messiah, or the more we are invoking his wrath when he does return, because he will not permit there to be any space between the two. Because together they are prophesied to achieve together that ideal balance of the Torah and the testimony. And so in Revelation, we get John repeatedly describing these two children, the Torah and the testimony. And of course, the testimony, we said last week, is the resurrection of Yeshua. And that's the specialty of the house of Joseph. But Judah doesn't wait till the resurrection to study the Torah. He remains in the Torah, and he will draw near to Joseph even before he has a firsthand testimony of the resurrection. Judah's firsthand testimony of the resurrection has yet to come. So, where we ended last week was right here in Ezekiel 29, 1-4, where it says, in the 10th year, in the 10th month, the 12th day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Pharaoh, king of Egypt, O great monster. And that great monster is Hatanin. Tanin. A tanin can be a dragon, a sea monster, a sea dragon, but it's also a crocodile, which is why it's identified with Pharaoh, because he was like the crocodile of the Nile. He owned it. He had no natural enemies. You stick a foot in the water, you might go under. And so his presence struck fear in the hearts of anyone. And it says, O great monster, Hatanin, who lies in the midst of his rivers, who has said, my river is my own. I've made it for myself. In other words, he says, I'm the creator. There is no Elohim. There is no sin as he might construct it for you. There is no scroll of the book. I make everything. I make the river. I make the earth. I make the rules. He says, but I will put hooks in your jaws and cause the fish of your rivers to stick to your scales. I will bring you up out of the midst of the rivers, and all the fish in your rivers will stick to your scales. So I know I've shown you this before, but if there's anybody who's new and they haven't heard me say this till they're sick of it, when you see a phrase or a word repeated that close in the neighborhood, you have to pay attention, because what you might be receiving is a double prophecy, a prophecy that it would extend maybe to 2 time periods. And if you see the repetition right here, I will put hooks in your jaws and cause the fish of your rivers to stick to your scales. That happened in the time of Moses Pharaoh. That Pharaoh went after the Israelites. The fish of his rivers were his warriors, and they stuck to his scales. They followed him in the pursuit of Israel, and therefore they were destroyed with him. His fish were destroyed. Remember, Ephraim and Manasseh are going to have fish. They're going to multiply like fish, and then those fish are going to have to stick to something. And Yeshua was that something. And that's why next week, when we start looking at the gematria of the serpent and the beast, and we realize it matches Messiah and Elijah, we're going to say, what? But this explains the mimicry of the serpent and the beast in this mission. And so it says, I'll cause the fish of your river to stick to your scales. That's happened in the past. But then it's a repetition. I will bring you up out of the midst of your rivers. Okay, he's there in the rivers. He died. He died in that judgment along with his warriors, along with the fish stuck to his scales. They were sent down into Abaddon. They were sent into the abyss. There will be a time, he says, I will bring you up out of the midst of your rivers. In other words, I will, in a sense, draw you out again. And all the fish in your rivers will stick to your scale. Basically, all the dead things are going to again stick to you. And they will once again stick to you while I reel you in. I'll set the hook in your jaw, and I will start to reel you in. And all those who are of death, those who cling to death, they will stick to you, and they will be reeled in along with you. This prophecy comes in the 10th year, in the 10th month, in the 12th day of the month. Okay, it just passed. It was Sunday. And so there was a hook set in a jaw. Or maybe it was at the last 10th of Tevet, or maybe it's at every 10th of Tevet on that second day after. And maybe this is why we're fasting, that we don't stick to the wrong scales, that we stick to the scales of Yeshua, that we stick with Judah to the scales of Yeshua, of the word, of the testimony, the Torah. We stick together with that, and so that we won't be distracted. And as Pharaoh has the hook set in his jaw, we would not, out of rebellion, out of ignorance, out of being deceived, out of being apathetic, that we wouldn't stick ourselves to that monster, because he will be reeled in and destroyed once again. And so that's why we always want to fast now on the 10th of Tevet, because whatever happened on Sunday, I mean, I looked at the news and I thought, well, there might be some things there, with COVID. There might have been some things set in motion, even with the explosion in Nashville, which incidentally is called the Athens of the South. That's its nickname, just like the Big Apple is New York. Who knows? I think this is something we may only truly see in hindsight. We might have to look back months from now and say, okay, based on the things that are happening now, I can see that there was a hook set in the jaw on the 12th of Tevet. And maybe it was this year, and maybe it was back in January. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I can just tell you about it. I can read it to you. Let's see, man, we're out of time, and there's so much and it's just too far to go. Okay, we'll save that for next week. That's a good stopping place anyway. But where we're going next week is we're going to see why Scripture, I misspelled Pharaoh, that bugs me, why Scripture connects Sukkot as a commemoration of when you came out of Egypt. In other words, a Sukkot without Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt, being the linchpin of what you're doing at Sukkot, is not really a Sukkot at all. And so next week we'll look at what happens at Sukkot in relation to the Leviathan, the Tanin, the sea dragon, and then the Nachash, which is the land-based serpent. You'll see three serpents. You'll see Leviathan, the worldwide serpent. You'll see Pharaoh as a more tangible expression of Leviathan, which is Tanin, the monster of the Nile, the great crocodile of the Nile. And then the land-based serpent is the Nachash. And you see that in Revelation. You'll see things coming both up out of the sea and from the earth. And it just gets more and more spectacular and a lot more complicated. And that's why I urge you, just even though we're hitting highlights of things as we study the Torah portions, it's really important that you read the whole Torah portion, even if we're not doing it in class, because you can't do it. It's too deep and rich. You can only take little bites of it. But for yourself, continue reading the whole Torah portion, because that's the only way some of this stuff makes sense.